I bought an iPad from a stranger on Craigslist for $100. It seemed like a good deal. What I found inside was far more disturbing than anything I could have imagined. A secret history that challenged everything I believed about trust, danger, and when it's right to speak up. I was browsing Craigslist and found an iPad listed for a decent price by a man named Thomas. He looked to be around 40 in his profile picture and sounded friendly enough over email. We set up a meeting at his suburban house one afternoon. When I pulled up, the place looked like something out of a real estate listing. Manicured lawn, clean driveway, no sign of anything sketchy. He answered the door wearing jeans and a polo shirt, holding the iPad in one hand. He invited me in, and as soon as I stepped inside, I heard a child laughing somewhere deeper in the house. It was faint, as if they were in another room, but it added to the sense of normalcy. He handed me the iPad and let me check that it turned on. He even threw in a sturdy black protective case, saying he had just upgraded to a newer model. We went over the payment, I handed him the cash, and the whole thing was done in less than 10 minutes. He didn't try to upsell me, he didn't make small talk that dragged on too long, just a quick, smooth exchange. I left thinking I had scored a great deal. Back at my apartment, I set the iPad on my desk and plugged it in to charge while I made some coffee. When it had enough battery, I started going through the setup process. That's when I noticed something odd. There was no prompt to create a new account. The device was still logged in to his Apple ID. It was already late in the day, so I figured I would just factory reset it later. Before doing that, I decided to take a quick look at what was still on it. Out of curiosity more than anything else, I opened the photo gallery. There were hundreds of images, almost all of them clearly personal. Family shots, holiday pictures, selfies. I was about to close out when one folder caught my eye. It was labeled New Beginning, and it had an unusual number of files inside. The thumbnail previews didn't look like family pictures. I tapped it open. The first few photos looked like they had been taken from a distance on a street, focused on a young woman, maybe mid-20s with dark hair. In every single one, she was completely unaware she was being photographed. Walking to work, carrying groceries, waiting for a bus. I scrolled further and saw more shots taken from inside what looked like a parked car through a windshield, with her in the frame on the sidewalk. Then there were images of her sitting in coffee shops, taken through windows from across the street. The timestamps went back nearly 3 years. It was the same woman in every picture. They weren't posed, none were selfies with her in them. These were deliberate, long-range shots taken from behind, from across roads, through glass. The backgrounds changed. Different seasons, different parts of town. But the subject was always her. Some photos were taken from what looked like higher up, maybe from the window of a building across from hers. In a few, I recognized the same apartment entrance in the background. It was like watching her life in fragments, each moment captured without her knowledge. The further I scrolled, the more it became clear these weren't random. They were organized chronologically, documenting her daily routine, where she went, what time of day, who she was with. It was unsettling in a way that made my hands tighten on the device. I stopped when I reached the most recent ones. They were from just a few weeks ago. In one, she was unlocking her apartment door. In another, she was walking into a grocery store at night. The quality of the photos was good enough to see her facial expressions, the color of her coat, the small bag slung over her shoulder. I put the iPad down on my desk and just stared at the folder name again. New Beginning. The whole thing felt like I was holding someone's stalker file. At first, the pattern in the folder was rigid and cold. Every image felt like surveillance, each one taken from a distance, the woman framed like a subject under observation. Then, scrolling deeper, the tone shifted. In one photo, reflected in a shop window behind her, I noticed a figure, Thomas, blurred and small in the background. At first, he was only there by coincidence, his face half turned or hidden. But with each new cluster of shots, he edged closer. A week later in the timeline, he appeared standing a few feet behind her at an outdoor market, looking straight at the camera as if testing the distance. Then came a jarring jump. Suddenly, they were together in the frame. No more glass panes or long lenses. These were selfies. His arm around her shoulders, both of them smiling at the lens. Dinner plates on a table, wine glasses, soft lighting. Their clothes changed with the seasons. Light jackets in autumn, heavier coats in winter, but always the same closeness. The dates and file names told the story without words. What had started as months of shadowing her from across streets was now weekends away. Bright sunlight over tourist spots, hands held across cafe tables. The folder moved through holidays. Christmas tree lights behind them, bundled scarves. A caption in the metadata mentioned a cabin rental. A summer trip at the beach. Both of them sunburned, holding cones of melting ice cream. Then engagement photos. Her hand outstretched, a ring glittering, his smile wide. After that came the wedding. Formal poses, relatives in suits, a white dress that almost glowed in the shots. Finally, images of a small child with their combined features, squinting at the camera in sunlight, clinging to Thomas's leg. The woman from those first long-range shots was now his wife, the mother of his child. I sat back in my chair, staring at the screen, trying to reconcile the two narratives. One built from months of calculated pursuit, the other a catalog of mutual affection. The contrast made my skin prickle. I thought about that faint sound I had heard in his house during the sale, the child's laughter from somewhere deeper inside. That must have been their son. The folder had turned from something that made my stomach knot to something that, on the surface, looked like a normal family album. But I couldn't erase the beginning from my mind. The hundreds of images where she was nothing more than an unknowing target. I went through it all again from start to finish. Hours slipping by without me noticing. It was like watching two films spliced together. The first half, a stalker's meticulous archive. The second half, a public display of a happy, ordinary life. The latest pictures showed birthday parties, playground visits, messy ice cream faces. A boy proudly holding up a finger-painted drawing. She looked relaxed, her smile unforced. He looked the same in every frame, confident, comfortable, settled. I kept wondering whether she had ever known about the early part. If she didn't, what story had she been told about how they met? A casual introduction at a cafe? A mutual friend? A chance encounter at work? In the pictures, she looked at him like she trusted him completely. That trust was the part that sat heaviest in my thoughts. Over the next few weeks, I couldn't get it out of my head. I thought about finding her, somehow getting a message to her that the man she married had been following her long before she knew him. But every time I pictured doing it, I saw the child in those images smiling in a paper crown at a birthday table. I imagined what that kind of revelation would do to him. I thought about the police, but what would I even report? The photos were old, and whatever line had been crossed back then, it had apparently been smoothed over by years of marriage. There was no visible sign of danger in the present, at least not in the images. To any outsider, they were just a family living a normal life. Sometimes I opened the folder just to look at the first set of images again, as if trying to remind myself it had been real. The first picture in the sequence was the one that unsettled me most. Her waiting for a bus in the rain, holding a grocery bag, completely unaware she was being watched. Every family photo that came after sat on top of that moment, like a layer of paint over something you can still feel beneath your fingertips. After a month of wrestling with it, I decided to erase it all. I transferred the pictures to an encrypted folder, then deleted it entirely, emptying the trash so there was no easy way back. It felt like shoving a box into a fire and watching it burn. My apartment was quiet. The only sound was the hum of the fridge. But my head was loud with arguments I had been having with myself for weeks. I told myself that maybe she knew. Maybe they had laughed about it as an odd story from their past. I told myself that not every relationship starts clean, that people can change, that maybe what began in an unhealthy way had somehow settled into something stable. I told myself a lot of things because the alternative was believing I just left someone in the dark about something that could shatter her life. Even now, I still catch myself thinking about her. I imagine her walking home from the store, holding her son's hand, thinking about dinner, unaware that a stranger once sat in a different apartment, staring at a record of her life from the moment before she knew it was being recorded. Sometimes, late at night, when my mind drifts back to that afternoon in Thomas's living room, I hear that child's laugh again in my memory. Light, careless, happy. It echoes in my head when I weigh what the right thing would have been. It's the sound that stops me from telling myself I should have done more, because I can't separate it from the idea of what might break if I had. The iPad is long gone now, sold off to cover rent during a lean month. But the story it carried is something I can't quite let go. It lives somewhere between guilt and resignation, between the urge to warn and the fear of ruining something that looks from the outside like it's working. And every so often, when I least expect it, I catch myself listening for that laugh, wondering if I would even recognize it in the real world, wondering whether it would still sound the same if the truth ever came out. I thought I was getting the deal of a lifetime on a PlayStation console. What I actually got was a glimpse into something far more dangerous, a carefully orchestrated trap designed to rob and possibly worse. This is what I learned about trusting your instincts when everything feels too good to be true. Back when I was in college, I was working as a delivery driver to save up for a PlayStation. I checked Craigslist almost every day for a decent deal. One afternoon, I found a listing for a console with several games for only $80. The seller's name was Jason. He told me over email that he was moving to Oregon the following week and just wanted it gone fast. The price was way below the usual $300, but I didn't question it too much. I was broke, and getting a brand new console for that little was exactly the kind of luck I needed. Jason suggested meeting in an industrial area on the outskirts of town, because according to him, it was easier to park there. I remember thinking it was a bit out of the way, but I didn't have any reason to suspect anything bad. Looking back, meeting in an empty part of town with someone from Craigslist should have set off alarms in my head. But at the time, I just thought it would be a quick exchange. I agreed to meet after my evening shift ended, and I figured I'd finally get my console. When I arrived, the sun had just dipped low enough to cast everything in shadow. The industrial area was quiet. Rows of old warehouses, cracked pavement, and weeds growing through the asphalt. Most of the buildings looked abandoned, windows covered in grime or plywood. The place was completely deserted, except for a single rusted-out streetlight flickering by a chain-link fence. Jason had told me to pull up near an old warehouse with a faded red loading dock. As I turned into the lot, my headlights caught sight of 4 men standing off to the side. They weren't holding any kind of box, no sign of a PlayStation or anything like it. They weren't dressed like students or anyone just trying to sell something. Hoodies, caps pulled low, baggy jackets. They were watching my car before I even parked. One of them, a tall, skinny guy in a dirty baseball cap, broke off from the group and came up to my driver's side. I rolled the window down halfway, expecting him to introduce himself or maybe pull the console out of a bag. Instead, he leaned in close and said I needed to show him the money first. Then they would bring out the PlayStation. I kept glancing past him at the others. They weren't talking or laughing, they were just watching me. One of them shifted his weight like he was getting ready to move closer. My gut twisted. Something felt completely off. The kind of wrong where you know you shouldn't even be there. But I'd already driven across town, and my brain kept trying to tell me maybe I was just overthinking it. The skinny guy's hand was resting on my window frame. He repeated himself, "Let me see the cash." The other 3 hadn't moved, but their eyes were locked on me, and I realized I couldn't see where their hands were. The entire place was silent, except for the hum of my engine. I didn't answer right away. My wallet was in my jacket, but something in me didn't want to reach for it. Against my better judgment, I reached into my jacket and pulled out the folded stack of bills. I held it just high enough for him to see, hoping this would move things along and get the console into my hands. Instead, his eyes flicked over my shoulder, and I caught movement in my side mirror. One of the others was coming in from the left, another from the right. The last one stepped out from behind the corner of the warehouse, walking slowly toward my rear bumper. The air felt heavy, too still. The skinny guy's lips curled into something that wasn't a smile, and his hand slid down toward my door handle. That was the moment the reality of it hit me. There was no PlayStation, no sale. My stomach dropped. I shoved the gear shift into drive and slammed my foot on the gas. My tires squealed against the cracked asphalt. The car lurched forward hard enough to snap my head back. The skinny guy jumped away from the door, and in my rearview mirror, I saw one of the others swing his arm. Something, maybe a rock, maybe a tool, smacked into my rear window with a loud crack. A spiderweb of fractures spread across the glass, but it held. I gripped the wheel so tight my knuckles ached, eyes locked on the road ahead. My chest felt like it was going to burst from the pounding in my rib cage. I didn't look back again. I didn't want to know if they were chasing me. I pushed the car harder than I ever had, the speedometer needle climbing as the empty industrial blocks blurred past. My ears caught nothing but the roar of the engine and the faint rattle of the cracked glass behind me. I didn't stop until I saw lit storefronts, people walking, and the normal sound of city traffic filling my ears again. Only then did I slow down, pulling into a gas station lot and killing the engine, just to breathe. When I finally made it home, my hands were still trembling on the steering wheel. I sat there for a minute, the quiet of my driveway pressing in, before forcing myself inside. Once I'd calmed down enough, I opened my laptop and pulled up the Craigslist listing. For the first time, I really looked at the pictures instead of just the price. The background was all wrong. Bright store lighting, rows of neatly stocked boxes, and small white tags hanging off the shelves. It wasn't someone's living room or a personal photo at all. A quick image search confirmed what I already knew. The pictures were ripped straight from an electronics store's online catalog. I checked the contact info. The phone number was one of those disposable ones you could buy with prepaid minutes or even create online for a few days of use. No real name, no other listings under the account. My stomach turned. It was all so obvious now, and I couldn't believe I'd walked right into it. A week later, while making dinner, I caught a news segment that stopped me cold. A local couple had been robbed at gunpoint in that same industrial district. They'd gone there to buy a dirt bike from a Craigslist ad. The suspects matched exactly what I remembered. 4 men, hoodies and caps, working together. The couple had been forced out of their car, wallets taken, and left in the middle of the lot while the thieves drove off in their vehicle. The report said they weren't harmed physically, but it was clear from the woman's shaky voice on camera that it had been terrifying. Hearing it confirmed what I'd been trying not to admit. I had been seconds away from the same thing, maybe worse. I didn't sleep much that night. The images looped in my head. The slow approach from all sides, the hand on my door handle, the crack of glass behind me. The next morning, I drove to the police station. I filled out a report giving them the address from the listing, the phone number, the description of all 4 men, and even the exact time I'd been there. The officer nodded, typing it all in, but I could tell from his careful tone that they didn't expect much to come from it. They'd add it to the ongoing investigation. I left with a case number and the uneasy sense that the men who tried to trap me were still out there, waiting for the next easy target. I ended up buying my PlayStation a month later from a regular electronics store. I used my credit card and paid the full retail price. Walking out with the sealed box in my arms, I felt almost ridiculous for how relieved I was, but it was worth it. No secrecy, no deserted lots, no strangers with their hands on my car door. Since then, I've never agreed to meet anyone from an online ad in an isolated area. If a seller won't meet in a busy public place, preferably somewhere with cameras, I just walk away from the deal. It doesn't matter how good the price is. Saving a few hundred isn't worth gambling with your safety. Every time I pass through that part of town now, I glance toward those warehouses. The cracked asphalt, the rusted fence, the flickering streetlight. It all looks exactly the same. I picture my car idling there, the 4 figures moving closer, and I still feel the same rush of adrenaline that pushed my foot down on the gas. That night didn't cost me any money or injuries, but it burned a permanent lesson into me. When something feels wrong, it usually is, and walking or driving away might be the only right choice you have left.
I was making decent side money flipping antiques from estate sales. One listing I posted almost cost me and my family everything, not from what I sold, but from what I almost didn't prevent. This is the story of how a child's laughter saved us from something I didn't see coming until it was almost too late. I was making decent side money flipping antiques that I found at estate sales. It was not glamorous, but the margins were good if I picked the right pieces. That week, I had scored a box of vintage pocket watches. They were in beautiful condition, heavy in the hand, and each one was made by a different maker. I cleaned them up carefully, photographed them in good lighting, and put the whole lot on Craigslist for what I thought was a fair but still tempting price. Within a couple of hours, a guy messaged me saying he would take all of them for cash. He did not haggle. He did not ask for individual photos. He just said he would swing by my apartment the next day. That kind of response usually meant a serious buyer. So I told him my address and we agreed on late afternoon. I even told my wife that we might finally clear that box out of the hall closet. That afternoon came and went. No knock on the door, no message saying he was running late. I tried calling the number he had given me, but his phone went straight to voicemail. The next day, it didn't even ring. I just heard the disconnected recording. My wife was irritated. She had been tripping over that box for a week and wanted the space back. I shrugged it off as just another Craigslist flake. But something about the speed of his first message and then the dead phone number felt strange. Weeks passed. I sold a couple of watches individually, but most stayed in that box. Every so often, my wife would point at it while she vacuumed, and I would tell her I would list them again soon. Eventually, I stopped thinking about that buyer entirely. 8 months later, my cousin got out of prison after a stretch for credit card fraud. I drove out to meet him at a bar. We nursed beers and talked about old times. Then he started in on prison stories, stuff about cellmates, the trades they ran inside, all the hustles. Then he mentioned this one guy who ran a crew that specialized in antique thefts. According to my cousin, they had been planning a job targeting some guy selling collectible watches they had found on Craigslist. They had it all lined up, my cousin said, picking at the label on his bottle. They knew when and where they would hit him. But they canned it last minute. One of the guys called the seller, and while they were talking, he heard kids in the background. The boss says, "Nah, we are not doing that with kids around." He stopped talking, but I barely heard him. My mind was running back to that box of pocket watches in my apartment. The buyer who never showed. The call that went dead. My cousin did not notice that I had gone quiet. He just kept telling stories. I sat there gripping my beer, the noise of the bar fading into the background, realizing exactly how close I might have come to opening my door to something a lot worse than a no-show buyer. I sat there with the bottle sweating in my hand. My cousin was still talking about other scams and schemes like nothing he had just said mattered. But my head was stuck on one detail. That call with the buyer months ago. It had not been a quick one. He had asked a couple of questions about the condition of the watches and what brands they were. I remembered having to repeat myself because my daughter was sitting cross-legged on the rug in front of the TV, giggling at some cartoon. She was loud enough that I had actually stood up, walked toward the kitchen, and still her laughter carried into the phone. Now it clicked. Those guys were not being careful about price or details. They were checking me out, listening for anything that might make the job messy. And they had heard her voice. I could see it in my mind. Some guy on the other end, looking at his buddy, shaking his head, saying it's not worth it with a kid in the room. I didn't even hear the rest of my cousin's story. I just stared at the condensation dripping down the side of my beer bottle, my stomach tightening at the thought of how close I had been to something I never would have seen coming. If they had gone through with it, I would have opened the door expecting a buyer and instead encountered robbers, maybe worse. When my cousin finally noticed I wasn't responding, I told him flat out. "That was me," I said. "That was my apartment." I laid out the whole thing, the Craigslist ad, the guy calling almost immediately, the no-show, the dead number. My cousin just raised his eyebrows. A faint smirk was on his face, like he didn't buy a word of it. He shook his head. "Man, I wouldn't put too much stock in that. Guys like that don't care about kids. Hell, half of them have got their own. You think they would stop a job over some voices on the phone? Nah, they probably just figured the score wasn't worth it." But I could feel it in my gut. I had been around enough people to know when something lined up too perfectly to be random. The timing fit exactly. The call had ended abruptly, and then nothing. No messages, no second attempt to meet, just complete silence. It was the only thing that made sense. I leaned back in my chair, looking past him toward the bar's neon beer signs, and thought about how different that day could have gone if my daughter had been at daycare like she usually was. The buyer would have heard nothing in the background except my voice. No reason to think anyone else was there. No reason to call it off. That image stuck in my head for days afterward. I replayed it over and over. A knock at the door, me opening it, maybe a gun already out, the sound of my wife in the kitchen, the confusion turning to panic. It was like watching a scene in a movie that you can't pause, knowing exactly where it's headed. And every time it ended in the same place, with my family on the wrong side of it. My cousin dropped it after that night, moving on to other stories from the inside. But I couldn't. I started looking at every Craigslist message differently. Every "is this still available" became a possible setup. I began thinking about how much information I gave out without realizing it. An address, times I would be home, even little things like what I might have sitting around in plain view when a buyer showed up.
We still had a few of the watches sitting in the closet. I ended up selling them off one at a time, but I met the buyers in a coffee shop near the highway. I would get there early, pick a table with my back to the wall, and keep the box under the table until I saw the cash. Even then, I never told them where I lived. I never let them follow me back to my car without making sure the parking lot was crowded. I did not tell my wife the whole story right away. I just said I wanted to start meeting people in public for safety. She thought it was about avoiding flakes and no-shows, and I let her think that. There was no point in making her replay the same nightmare scenarios I had running in my head. Months later, my cousin brought it up again when we were on the phone. He still laughed it off, said I was being paranoid, that there was no way those guys would have just walked away like that. But I did not bother arguing. Some things you just know. Those were not random thieves looking for a quick score. They were organized. They knew exactly what the watches were worth, and they had a plan. The only reason it did not happen was because one small thing changed in that moment. A kid's laughter bleeding through a cheap phone speaker. Now, every time I post something for sale, I think about that call. I think about how easy it is to invite danger right to your front door without realizing it. I meet in public. I keep the conversation short. And I never, ever let a stranger step into my home. Sometimes I look at my daughter while she is sitting on the floor playing, and I wonder if she will ever know about that day. She probably will not remember the cartoon she was watching, or how hard she laughed, or how her voice carried across the room. But I will remember it. I will remember it because it might have saved all of us, and that is not something you forget. I thought I was buying a used bike from a stranger. What I actually found was a predator who had learned how to hunt through the internet, and a nightmare that didn't end when I refused his offer. This is the story of how saying no to someone dangerous isn't always enough, and what it takes to truly escape. When I first moved to Philadelphia, I rented a small one-bedroom apartment in a quiet, older neighborhood that sat between downtown and the river. The rent was reasonable for the area, but without a car, I knew I would need something reliable to get me to my new design job across town. Public transit was possible, but the nearest station was a 20-minute walk, and I did not love the idea of waiting on late-night trains after working overtime. A bike made sense. It was cheap to maintain, easy to store, and fast enough to cut my commute time in half. One Saturday morning, I pulled up Craigslist and filtered the listings to a 10-mile radius. Most of what I saw was overpriced or in rough condition. A lot of rusted frames, bent spokes, and worn-out chains. Then I spotted one that looked promising. Matte black frame, new tires, clean chain, and a price that was surprisingly fair. The post was from a guy named David, and his place was about 20 minutes away by bus. We set up a time for me to come by that afternoon. David's house was a narrow row home on a block of mismatched brick fronts. When he opened the door, he had on a pair of stained work pants and a flannel shirt rolled up at the sleeves. His beard was long and streaked with gray, and he stood close enough when he spoke that I caught the faint smell of oil and metal, maybe from working in a garage. The bike was leaning against his living room wall, and at first glance it looked exactly like the photos. No scratches, gears shifting smoothly when I tested them, brakes tight and responsive. He seemed eager to watch me inspect it, standing less than a foot away as I crouched to check the tires. Each time I looked up, he was watching my face closely. He made comments I was not expecting about my eyes, my smile, even the way I dressed. They were not jokes or casual remarks. They felt too pointed for someone I had just met. I nodded without responding and kept my focus on the bike. The price was good enough that I decided not to drag things out. I told him I would take it, pulled the folded bills from my jacket, and held them out. That is when his expression shifted. Instead of taking the money, he smiled and said, "You know, if you would have dinner with me sometime, I would give you the bike for free." I did not laugh, and I did not make eye contact. I just said, "No, I will pay what we agreed on," and kept my hand out with the cash. He hesitated, his fingers drumming lightly against his thigh, before finally taking the bills. "Suit yourself," he said, but his tone had flattened. He handed me the bike, and I wheeled it toward the door. As I stepped outside, he called after me, voice louder than before. "We will probably see each other around the neighborhood soon." It was not a question, and it did not sound like small talk. The way he said it, slow, like it was something to remember, made the back of my neck tighten. I glanced over my shoulder once, just long enough to see him still standing in the doorway, watching as I walked the bike toward the corner. That evening, my phone lit up while I was making pasta and adjusting the new saddle height. An unknown number said it was David. He was sorry for the misunderstanding about dinner. He only meant to be friendly. A second text came, longer, telling me how good the bike would be for my commute, and how I seemed smart and careful, and not like the usual people he saw on Craigslist. I replied that the sale was finished and to please stop contacting me. I blocked the number after the fourth message. 10 minutes later, a new number popped up. Same cadence, same little compliments. He referenced the exact time I had left his house. That detail made me picture him still standing in the doorway, tracking the minute I turned the corner. I blocked that one too. By 9 o'clock, he had found my Instagram. I don't use my last name there, but my profile photo shows me holding a toad I designed. A blank account sent a direct message saying I shouldn't worry. He was a neighbor. He had shown me where he lived, which meant I had leverage. He wrote that this proved he was trustworthy. I stared at the request and tried to understand how he thought that sounded safe. I denied it and set my account to private. At 10 o'clock, a WhatsApp ping arrived. The profile photo was a blurry truck tailgate. He repeated the same apology and said dinner could be nothing formal, just soup at his place. The phrasing made my stomach tighten because he said at his place, like I had already agreed. I blocked again, cleared the cache, and put the phone in a drawer. I checked the windows and locked the back door and told myself I was being dramatic. I slept badly. I kept replaying what I had said at his house. I had told him my first name. I had said I worked downtown. I had mentioned the neighborhood I moved from when we talked about hills on my route. None of it felt like much at the time. Now it felt like a list he could stack together.
The next morning, there was silence until midday. Then an email came from a throwaway address. He mentioned food trucks near my office, which meant he had searched my name with design. My portfolio site lists my studio street on the contact page. I closed the tab and walked 2 blocks to a pharmacy to buy a prepaid SIM. I swapped it in at a coffee shop bathroom, texted my new number to a few people, and powered the old phone down. By the 3rd day, he had tried Facebook, LinkedIn, and even sent a request to follow a locked Pinterest board I kept for apartment ideas. His tone shifted from apologetic to impatient. He said I was being rude after his gesture. He told me I could bring a friend to dinner if I was nervous. He said I must be busy. The way you looked, you work hard. I started saving screenshots in a folder. I began a draft police report. I kept my shades down and lights low at night. I started using the service entrance at work and had coworkers walk me to the subway. His last messages before I stopped checking said, "You do not have to be scared. I showed you where I live. You can trust me. You owe me that." The word "owe" stayed in my head. A week after I had bought the bike, I worked late and reached the lobby after dark. I pushed the bike through the revolving door and spotted him immediately across the street near a newsstand. Blue work pants, long beard, arms crossed, watching the entrance. I turned back inside before the outer doors closed. Ron, the night security guard, looked up. I told him a man who had been contacting me was outside. I said I had bought a bike, said no to dinner, and now he would not leave me alone. Ron did not ask for more. He put on his jacket and walked out. I watched from behind a column. Ron gestured across the street. David moved closer, but stayed at the corner because of traffic. They spoke out of earshot. Ron's hands stayed low, palms open. David's moved in and out of his pockets. Ron pointed at our door, then at the camera above it, then down the block. The talk lasted 2 minutes. David's posture dropped. He rubbed his beard, nodded once, and walked away without looking back. Ron waited until he was gone, then came inside and asked if I wanted an escort to the train. I said I had my bike. He told me to wait 5 minutes so David could head the wrong way. We stood in silence until the time passed. Ron walked me out, stayed while I unlocked the bike,
and watched me ride off. I never saw David again. The messages stopped the same night. My old number stayed off for a week. When I turned it back on, there was nothing new. I do not know what Ron told him. Maybe it was the mention of cameras, police, or a warning in terms David understood. Whatever it was, it worked. I kept the bike for 2 years. It got me to work through summer heat and winter slush. I replaced the chain once, patched tubes twice, but I never met a seller or buyer again without thinking about that week. Now I meet in public, use a number I can throw away, and walk if something feels wrong. I eventually sold the bike to a college kid who showed up with his mom at a busy cafe. He paid cash and wheeled it out to the sidewalk while I watched from the window. It was just a bike to him. To me, it had been a lesson I didn't need twice. Sometimes the best deals cost more than they seem. I was 23 and broke, searching for cheap furniture on Craigslist for my first apartment. I found a deal so good it seemed impossible. It was. What I discovered on the other end of that listing changed how I understood the difference between a bargain and a trap, and what it means to arrive at the wrong place at the right moment. When I was 23, I finally got my own apartment in Phoenix. It was not anything special. 1 bedroom, 2nd floor, kind of old, but it was mine, and I was determined to furnish it without going broke. My savings were thin after paying deposits and moving costs, so my plan was to hunt for deals anywhere I could. My dad, Robert, was all in to help. He owned a small construction company and had a work truck, so if I found anything big, he could haul it over. We sat at my new place one night, scrolling through Craigslist on my laptop, filtering by furniture and free or cheap. Most of what came up was either already claimed or looked like it had been dragged out of a dumpster. Then we hit an ad that did not make sense at first. A full set of living room furniture, a bed frame with a mattress, a small dining table, a few appliances, and bags of clothes, all for $250. I clicked through expecting blurry photos or a vague description, but it was detailed. Each item was listed, and the pictures looked recent. A beige sofa in good shape, a queen bed with matching nightstands, a stainless steel microwave, even a set of pots and pans. Dad and I traded a look. Deals like that were rare and usually a scam. I read the description out loud. The seller's name was Stacy, and she wrote that her boyfriend Derek had taken off 3 weeks ago without any warning, leaving all of his belongings behind. She had given him time to come back for them, but after hearing nothing, she wanted it all gone. "I just need the space," her ad said. It sounded a little too straightforward, so I called the number she had listed. Stacy answered on the second ring. Her voice was even casual. I asked if everything in the pictures was still available. She said yes, adding that she had had a couple of no-shows already. When I asked why she was selling so cheap, she repeated what was in the ad. Derek had disappeared. She was done waiting, and she did not want to drag things out trying to sell everything piece by piece. Her tone did not have that rushed, jittery feel scammers sometimes have. She did not ask for any kind of deposit. She just said, "If you can come get it all, it is yours for $250. She did not seem pushy, which made it feel more legit. But Dad still asked to see more proof. I texted her after the call and asked if she could send more pictures. Within minutes, my phone buzzed with a new batch. Clear shots from different angles, even close-ups showing the appliances plugged in and working. A few minutes later, she sent a short video, panning through the apartment. You could see everything stacked neatly along the walls, ready to go. It all looked like a clean lived-in space, not some storage unit or staged setup. The story still seemed odd, but neither of us saw anything that screamed scam.
After some back and forth, we agreed on a pickup time. Saturday morning at 9 o'clock. She gave me her address on Maple Street, not far from a quiet residential area. Dad wrote it down on a scrap of paper he kept in his shirt pocket. The rest of the week we talked about it on and off. Dad kept saying that is a lot of stuff for $250, like he was trying to figure out what the catch might be. I reminded him that sometimes people just wanted things gone fast. He nodded but did not say much else. I could tell he was still turning it over in his head. Saturday came and we were up early. Dad pulled his truck into the lot outside my building just before 8 o'clock. The flatbed cleared out and ready. We brought moving blankets, straps, and gloves. He ran jobs where loading heavy, awkward stuff was routine, so he had all the right gear. I had taken out the cash the night before and had it folded into an envelope in my bag. The drive to Maple Street was quiet, a mix of small talk and GPS directions. The neighborhood was tidy, with two-story houses spaced evenly apart and trimmed lawns. No boarded windows, no trash piling up by the curb. A couple of people were out walking dogs, waving at each other in that easy way neighbors do when they have lived in the same place for years. We slowed as we scanned for the address Stacy had given, watching for the house numbers nailed above porches or panted on mailboxes. Dad eased the truck along the curb, keeping his eyes on the road but glancing toward each driveway we passed. When we turned onto the right driveway, the house looked normal enough. White siding, a small porch, a couple of planters by the steps. But as Dad slowed to a stop, I noticed the front door was standing wide open. It was not propped or swinging in the wind. It was just open, dark inside beyond the frame. We sat there for a moment, engine idling, both of us waiting for someone to appear. When no one did, Dad killed the engine and stepped out cautiously, telling me to stay in the truck. He called out, "Hello?" But the only answer was the distant sound of a lawnmower a few houses down. Something about the silence around the house felt heavy. I got out too, ignoring his look, and walked up beside him. We called again, louder, our voices carrying down the street. Still nothing. Dad frowned, muttering that this doesn't feel right. He suggested we should just get back in the truck and go, that we could always call later to see if she was okay. I was about to agree when I glanced at the large front window and saw a shape inside. My brain needed a second to register it. Someone was lying on the floor barely a few feet from the couch. At first, I thought maybe she had fainted or fallen asleep, but the stillness was absolute. No movement, no shifting, not even the faint rise and fall of breathing from where we stood. My stomach tightened.
I told Dad what I saw, and he stepped up for a better look, his jaw tightening when he caught sight of her. "We are not going in," he said firmly. "We call this in right now." He was already pulling out his phone, dialing 911. I stayed on the porch, staring at that unmoving figure through the glass while he gave the dispatcher the address and described what we had found. They told us to wait outside and not to enter under any circumstances. Within minutes, we could hear sirens approaching. 2 patrol cars pulled up, followed by an ambulance. Officers stepped out quickly, hands resting on their holsters as they approached. Dad explained who we were and why we were there, showing them the Craigslist printout and the scrap of paper with the address. They told us to stay back as they entered. It did not take long before one of them came back out, expression grim, speaking into his radio. The paramedics never even unloaded their gear. An officer walked over and confirmed in a flat voice, "The woman inside is deceased." He did not say more right then, just ask us to remain while detectives arrived. I felt a cold, empty drop in my chest, like my body knew the words before my brain caught up. Detectives showed up within half an hour, plain clothes but with badges clipped to their belts. They separated Dad and me to take statements.
I scrolled through my phone, showing them the texts and the pictures Stacy had sent. They noted the timestamps, asking when she had last confirmed our meeting. I told them it had been the day before, late afternoon. One of them asked if I knew anything about her personal life, her boyfriend, anything unusual she had mentioned. I shook my head. Everything she told me was in the ad, that her boyfriend had left and had not been in contact. I could tell they already had their own theory. When they were done, they stepped aside with a few of the uniformed officers. Eventually, one came back to explain what they had learned so far. They believed the man she had described, Derek, had come back unexpectedly. They thought he had discovered her plan to sell his belongings, maybe even seen the ad itself on her phone or computer. Something in him had snapped. The attack had been sudden and brutal. Multiple stab wounds, no sign of a struggle spreading beyond the living room. They did not tell me much more, but I did not need details to imagine what had happened in the hours before we had arrived. Every time I blinked, I saw her as I had through the window, frozen on the floor, and I knew it would stay with me. 2 days later, they called to say they had found Derek. He had been holed up in a low-budget motel in a neighboring state. They had tracked him through his phone and arrested him without incident. When they told me, there was no relief, just a hollow weight pressing harder. Somewhere in the days after, I learned an awful possibility. Our scheduled pickup time had been set in her phone. If Derek had been there that morning, maybe waiting for her to leave or trying to gather his things, that reminder could have gone off. It could have reminded him she was about to sell everything. That might have been the final spark in whatever rage had been building. That thought would not leave me. I kept running it through my head, wondering if we had never answered that ad, would she still be alive? The idea that a simple search for secondhand furniture could have played a part in someone's death made my stomach twist. Dad did not talk about it after the first week. He went back to work, and I tried to settle into my apartment, but I avoided that furniture search for a long time. Whenever Craigslist came up in conversation, I felt my pulse tick up. Eventually, I started looking again, but the feeling never left. The idea that behind any listing, there could be something dark, something you would never guess until you were already standing on the porch. It has been years now, but even scrolling past a photo of a couch or table can bring the smell of cut grass and the sound of distant sirens rushing back to me. Every deal feels like it might be hiding something. And I never forget that one morning on Maple Street when a bargain turned into something I would carry for the rest of my life.